Welcome everyone to our latest Critical Conversation event, one of a series of online fireside chats about topical issues impacting on engineering and society. My name's Hayatan Sillam and I'm the CEO of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. Here at the Royal Academy of Engineering, our overarching goal is to harness the power of engineering to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. And these critical conversations give us a chance to explore some of the challenges that we're going to need to address to achieve this goal. Today's discussion will consider how neurotechnology could influence our lives in the future. The combination of developments in neuroscience and advances in technology is creating powerful capabilities. It's enabling engineers to apply engineering principles to our study of and intervention in the human nervous system, and as a result, to begin transforming our lives. Today's discussion has been in large part inspired by the work of our Chairs in Emerging Technologies, which is a fantastic program providing long-term support for global visionaries working in disruptive technology areas, generously funded by the UK Government Department for Business. And we're currently welcoming applications for this scheme, so please do take a look if it's of interest. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by two very talented researchers, Professor Timothy Dennison and Professor Keith Matheson, both of whom are blazing a trail in the world of neurotechnology. People have been active in the field of neurotechnology for many decades now, but it's really only in the past several years that I think we've begun to realize its true significance and potential at a societal level. It offers us tools that can help us unlock understanding of how the human brain works, which is truly one of our research grand challenges, and improve the way that we manage, treat, and even prevent neurological conditions which impact on many millions of people around the world, from severe depression to bipolar disorder, epilepsy, and Parkinson's disease, along with many others. But there are also many intriguing potential applications beyond medicine. How could neurotechnology enhance social, educational, and physical development? And how will we navigate the ethical and societal dilemmas that this could pose? These are pertinent questions indeed, as developments in neurotechnology are now happening apace. It's been suggested that the global neurotechnology market size will reach over $14 billion this year. And we're seeing investment in brain research and neurotechnology growing right across the world as people seek to capitalize on the burgeoning innovation and tap into its potential benefits. So today's critical conversation gives us a chance to delve into these exciting developments, to explore what they mean for all of us, and to look at how the UK innovation landscape is evolving. I'm going to crack on and introduce our guests so that we can start the conversation. Professor Tim Dennison is a professor of neurotechnology at the University of Oxford and was awarded a Royal Academy of Engineering Chair in Emerging Technologies in 2018. Tim is working to improve treatments for diseases of the nervous system, collaborating with a variety of companies, including the UK-based Bioinduction Limited and Magstim Limited, all in support of this endeavour to bring forward new solutions for the treatment of mental health disorders through advanced power electronics, machine learning, and feedback control. And Professor Keith Matheson is a professor of neurophotonics at the Institute of Neurophotonics at the University of Strathclyde. He's also a current chair in emerging technologies, having been appointed in 2019. His research focuses on developing optoelectronic devices to interface with neural systems to understand aspects of neural processing. And his current research focuses on devices that function as implants to restore lost vision and brain interfacing technologies that could further our understanding of brain circuits and how they are affected in neurodegenerative disorders. And in 2021, Tim and Keith co-authored the first UK Neurotechnology Roadmap, and we'll hear more about that tonight. So a very warm welcome to you both, Tim and Keith. Delighted to have you here. I've got a few questions to start the conversation, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. So if you're watching online, please do pop your questions in the comments box, and I promise you I'll try to get through as many as possible, although I've got lots of my own as well. So, Tim, to kick us off, I think we have to get some basics right. Could you please explain what do we mean when we say neurotechnology or brain engineering, and where are we today? What's the state of play in neurotechnology today?
Well, thank you. And good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. So I think first it's important to establish the problem, which a recent report was suggesting that the societal cost of neurological disorders runs to about 100 billion pounds per annum in the UK. And of course, behind that number is an individual and their family who are, at a personal level dealing with the disease. So the role of brain engineering is to think about the application of engineering principles to try to address the disease state. And from a technology perspective, we mean areas such as material science, when we think about what does it take to interface to the nervous system, signal processing and classifiers, when we look to interpret what's going on in the body, and then areas of, say, control engineering, where we're saying, what do we do to try to modulate the nervous system? And if we can, restore it more towards a more normal neurotypical state. Now, what's important on the engineering side is that also includes other elements such as regulations, healthcare economics, and workflows for clinicians as well as the consumers and the patients using the technology. And we'll touch on several of those elements later on in the conversation. As kind of a snapshot in early 2023, there are areas of implants that can go into the brain. The cutting edge now is looking at, say, modulating a Parkinson's disease implant based on the rhythms that are observed in the brain and trying to, respond in real time to those, much like a home thermostat will adjust the boiler based on the temperature in the room. And then that's in the implantable space. Also, there's innovations going on in non-invasive systems, and those include, say, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you give a magnetic pulse and use that to induce activity in the brain, or some cutting edge research is looking at focused ultrasound and saying, can we go into the brain and make small perturbations without in any way, cutting through the skin barrier? So from the perspective of where we are, I think we're still very early in the stage, but that gives a kind of little preamble for some of the technologies we'll discuss tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. So Keith, turning to you now. Tim's talked about some of the applications that are already out there. Do you agree that neurotechnology is emerging as opposed to emerged? And what do you see as the key drivers of the recent progress that Tim is talking about?
Okay. Yeah, I think absolutely think it's emerging. And I think the reason for that is we've seen tremendous development in a number of fields that are very important to neurotechnology. So areas such as microelectronics and miniaturization of very sophisticated control electronics, all at very low power, that's enabling multi-channel interactions with the brain at a level we've never seen before. The ability to process that information through big data or AI, machine learning, that Tim alluded to, and also the incredible advances that's been made in the underpinning neuroscience, our understanding of neural circuits and how the brain works. That's been really tremendous in what we've seen. I think, in a way, a lot of that's been driven by major initiatives in the field. So I think, for instance, the US, it's invested about $2 billion in its BRAIN initiative, so brain research through advanced innovative neurotechnology. And that's been going on since 2013. But that's led to extremely well-funded research groups, and they've grown in a very healthy research ecosystem across the US that's also created many spin-outs. And so you've got this, not just a strong research base, but a healthy innovation sector in the area. And I think that's really what's changed, and it's led to an inflection point, if you like, in how neurotechnology is accelerating.
Okay, so Keith and Tim, you're both talking about exciting progress, but still that sense of this is just the start. So let's fast forward. Keith, maybe starting with you, where do you envisage neurotechnology will be by, say, 2050?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, that one, because the tendency is always to look back and see where it was and try and learn from that and see where it's going. And actually, I was struck recently by a BBC article where there was a woman talking about how she was implanted with a cardiac pacemaker when she was 11 days old. So this is back in the late 70s. And this is one of the first instances of it being implanted in an infant. And she talked about the very invasive surgery that they had. That this was involved cracking open the chest, and many operations throughout her lifetime, and the effect that had on her. and there's no doubt that was a life-saving series of operations, but there's no doubt also that there were consequences in terms of the surgery and the like. And then hearing that, I was reminded of a conference I was at just a few months ago, where one of the leading neurotechnology developers was talking about their latest pacemaker, which is now the size of a vitamin pill, as they call it. Very, very minimally invasive in terms of the implantation, and much more sophisticated in how it interacts with the heart. And I think that's the direction of travel. That devices are now becoming much more sophisticated, have many more channels. They'll be able to interface at a level we haven't been able to do before in terms of number of channels that can interface with the brain. They'll be able to report back what they're seeing, and then change how they modulate the brain, and they'll be able to do that in a much less invasive fashion, so that the complex surgery it won't be needed. So that, I think, is the direction of travel for neurotechnology over the coming decades.
Great.
Yeah. And building on Keith's point, in terms of even the invasiveness of the surgery. So there are startups and academics. One you might have seen recently, Synchron, out of Australia. They're actually now winding the device through the vasculature system. So, brain implant today usually involves drilling a hole through the skull and getting access. And they're looking at actually basically like a cardiac stent, and they're actually reusing some of that technology. And that's a key theme of technology: reuse, adaptation for the different needs. They can basically place a recording electrode over the kind of central motor region, and people are exploring using that as a brain-computer interface. I think stepping back for me, like in 2050, and what we need to work on together as a collective community is understanding also the core principles of how we're designing. So as we say, part of brain engineering is understanding the engineering principles that we need to apply to try to treat disease. An analogy I often use is kind of flight, and the steps that were taken towards heavier than air aircraft and controlled flight. And before there were wind tunnels and people were building the instrumentation, understanding the principles of aerodynamics, there are a lot of prototypes built and many of them crashed. But then when there's more of a systematic approach and discovery and investment in instrumentation, the field could actually really move forward. And I think an area where Keith, me, and our colleagues is not just investing in the therapies, but also enabling the equivalent of that wind tunnel, the scientific instrumentation, to try to better inform the engineering principles that we need in 2050. And so that, I think, ultimately is a key area of investment and opportunity to really unlock the next stage. So when we talk about the Parkinson's device, the original device was basically designed to replace what was historical, a surgical lesion, where the neurosurgeon would actually basically cut out tissue from the brain, and they replaced that with a static electrical circuit. But now, as we're learning more, it's becoming more dynamic and trying to think about the device acting much more like a surrogate nervous system, as opposed to just this kind of static pacemaker device.
That's really interesting. And I have a background in bioscience a long time ago, and I always found it interesting after I moved into engineering, how little we attach significance to the advances in instrumentation as a key enabler of the rest of the progress across the field of bioscience. So glad to hear you mention that, one of my bugbears. So Tim, let me stick with you. We've talked a lot about applications in the context of neurological disease, but what kinds of potential benefits could neurotechnology deliver for wider society?
Yeah, so first, just starting even wider society in the applications, and let's go outside of the brain to start. And so there's a lot of areas now that you might hear the word bioelectronic medicines. It's a nascent field. Galvani is in the UK as a GSK spinoff, and they're looking at, can we actually provide electrical stimulation out closer to the organs and actually look to treat diseases? Areas of broader influence that the bioelectronic medicine community considers are inflammation, diabetes, incontinence control. So that's one thing. It's just getting outside of kind of the cranium and thinking about how these technologies could apply broadly. I think another area of brain disorders, but we also have to be cognizant of in neurotech, is helping emerging markets. So to make this very salient, I work with a team trying to help with epilepsy treatment in low and middle income countries. And we had a visitor here from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he's one of 10 neurologists in a country of 200 million people. And half of them actually treat epilepsy. And so one of the opportunities for us in neurotechnology is to help to supplement clinicians around the globe and actually streamline the care and give more and improved access to therapies that exist for us that would benefit from the NHS in the UK. Now, longer term, now getting outside, I'm going to take one that you may not think about is neuromarketing. And so one area that is subtly behind the scenes for those of you like social media, as they say, when the product is free, that means you are the product, is that they're thinking about neurotechnology and how that can actually be used to understand how we're responding to advertisements and different, say, social media feeds. And that's being incorporated as well for advertisement, which kind of plants a seed for future discussions on ethics coming up. And Keith, I'll throw it over to you for a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess if we're thinking about sort of beyond neurological disorders, I guess Tim and I are more comfortable talking about the medical applications of these things. But I guess that's already happening to an extent. There's these EEG headsets, so they're recording bulk signals from the brain, and they're using those to inform sort of decision-making capabilities. So I guess the very famous one was Liverpool FC and the penalty taking during the FA Cup final, where the manager Jurgen Klopp credited developers of an EEG headset, and I guess that's a way of monitoring the signals in your brain, and I guess what they were trying to do there was replicate what they do in training and make sure that the players are able to focus and maintain their attention at crucial points in the game. So these things are already happening to an extent. I think there's challenges there. These headsets, they're monitoring global signals. That's necessarily not going to be that specific, and that's always a drawback with non-invasive technologies currently. Tim was highlighting invasive technologies. They've got the ability to really interface with neural circuits with great precision, both spatially and temporally. But they've got the drawback that they have to be implanted, and that's massive. So I think as we go beyond neurological disorders and into wider society, wearable is going to be the way to go in the immediate horizon, but it will suffer from that lack of specificity and patient or person variability, if you like.
Another, and kind of what you mentioned, the sports, is the gaming, I think, is another area where this will arise. And actually, the graphical processing units used in machine learning, the origins of those are really driven in graphical processing for video games. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be interesting to watch how neurotechnology starts to become embodied in the gaming community. And similar to a lot of societal improvements coming from games, a lot of neurotech in the next 5 to 10 years might actually be driven from trying to get an increased enhancement, if you will. You might have seen the game, the Jedi Force Trainer, measuring brain rhythms and using it to try to levitate a ball. And so trying to think about other physiological signals and how that might, improve gameplay, adjust the level till you're right at your breaking point based on your brain rhythms. You can imagine a lot of different ways this could be incorporated into a game algorithm.
Well, I'm thoroughly enjoying listening to you both, and I've got a long list of questions. Just to remind our audience that if you want to get your questions in, please do just drop them in the comments box, and I promise you I'll try and self-regulate and ask your questions and not just mine. But you're painting a very exciting, compelling picture, Tim and Keith. We're talking about not just the medical applications and the opportunity for those to become more sophisticated and less invasive, but actually some really quite broad-ranging applications in low and middle income countries in terms of expanding the ability to treat diseases that are pertinent there through to recreation and sport. All very exciting, but this is a powerful technology that interacts with society in quite a profound way. So Tim, you kind of alluded to the fact that there were some concerns or some watch points. Can I start with you, Keith? From your perspective, what would be the key concerns or watch points around neurotechnology that you think it's worth putting on the table at this stage?
I think one of the concerns we have in the field right now is that these sort of advanced devices that we're talking about, these are quite often relatively risky propositions in terms of the innovation landscape. So they're quite often taken up by SMEs and who do a fantastic job in accelerating that. And the idea is that this goes as quickly as possible towards clinical and societal impact. But just by the nature of the innovation landscape, not all of them are going to be successful. And that raises an important point around what happens if a patient's had an implant and the company supporting that no longer trades. And so I think it's very important that we consider the role perhaps of the regulator there in how we make sure that there's some I guess instruction set on how to remove the implants or some support there for the patient if they've had that longer term.
Absolutely. I think we'd all agree with that. So what about you, Tim? What would you like to add to the list of things that we've got to keep an eye on?
Well, I think one for us as a community is to be cautious of overhyping the technology. Many of the potential beneficiaries in the future, they're just desperate for either themselves or for someone they're caring for some kind of solution. And I think that I empathize with the regulators many times when they're actually trying to keep people on the right side of being absolutely transparent on the capabilities of systems as they exist today, just to make sure that we don't give false hope. And so I think we want to be optimistic, but be cautious about overhyping technology and its capabilities at any time. And we see that across technologies, kind of setting false expectations and then leaving people in a worse off state. Keith made a mention about long-term care for volunteers. That's, I think, something I'll double down on is a lot of the excitement of the BRAIN initiative and kicking off novel technologies also has left us with some significant questions to ask. And I'd say opportunities for us as a society to say, someone who volunteers for first in human trial, maybe we should treat them as an analog of the Veterans Administration or the like, where they basically put their lives on the line to try to help society out. And maybe we should actually, in a level of compensation, respect for that they put themselves in that position, say, we will actually now look out for your care for the rest of your life. Another area that I think a lot about is healthcare equity. And so with these new technologies coming about, especially if we talk about augmentation, making you having better judgment or raising your performance. Well, for those who can afford it, does it actually just tend to spread out the already challenges we have with inequity in society? I think we need to be very mindful about the implications of some of these technologies, think about the costs and what we can do to actually try to raise all elements of society and not actually further emphasize some of the challenges that we face today.
Well, some really, really interesting, important points you both just made there. So I'm sure we'll try and come back to some of those in the course of the discussion, but I can see lots of questions coming in from our audience. So let's turn to those first. So I'm going to start with Louisa McDonald, who's asking whether you think that epilepsy could be eradicated through neurotechnology. So asking you to take a bit of a punt on that one. Any volunteers to answer that one?
Well, I can get started because there's research today, and actually there are products out today for the treatment of epilepsy with neurotechnology, specifically brain stimulation is what I'm most familiar with. And so they're responsive neurostimulators, looking at where a seizure, they look for a state that's indicative of a seizure to apply stimulation. That's from a company called NeuroPace in the United States. There's also thalamic stimulators. And so a lot of it's very dependent on what type of epilepsy you have, what type of implant you're going to get. Now, Louisa, the challenge is that many of the recipients really would like to be seizure-free. And so that still remains a challenge in the field. I'm picking on that eradicated. Getting to seizure freedom is still a very big challenge where researchers and device technologists are trying to address. But the other thing I want to point out on this is that it doesn't mean at the expense of pharma. One of the other technologies that's being explored is merging infusion pumps that are implanted and can basically infuse a drug, an anticonvulsant, to a very localized area of the brain. So try to do its best to avoid a seizure state, but avoiding all the systemic side effects of a normal pharma treatment. So Louisa, it's on people's minds. It's a hot area of research, but the pathway to eradication is going to probably be a long one.
Thank you for that, Tim. I think relatively optimistic response. I'm going to turn to quite a different topic now from Ziyu Zheng, and I think it's relevant that they are a clinical neurosciences PhD student, and they're asking, how can people working in neuroimaging, such as MRI, get involved in the development of neurotechnology? It's a very exciting and appealing area. What are the sort of pathways into it? Who'd like? Keith, go on, you start with that one.
I think they're already involved, I would say. Many of the implantable devices that we've been talking about, one of the concerns is how compatible they are with MRI imaging or fMRI imaging, and that's a design constraint, if you like. But also, we do a lot of modulation in the brain, and we try to understand how that affects other neural circuits rather than regions in the brain. And techniques like fMRI are critical, really, in helping us understand that. So there are clinical groups who are doing fMRI both here and in the US, and they are working with neurotechnology people. So I think that's a pathway you can engage in, if you like.
Thank you, Keith. And I'm going to stick with this topic of imaging and turn to you, Tim, to perhaps have the first crack at question from Ilias Taktidis, who's asking, what will 2050 look like in terms of neurotechnologies for brain imaging specifically?
So it was not exactly my area of expertise, but I'll say some of the things I'm observing. So first is to reinforce what Keith just said. Some of the implantable technologies today are now conditionally MRI safe. And what becomes fascinating is what can we do with, say, functional MRI technology to get a better sense of how these devices are operating. So turning them on and off, modulating patterns from stimulation, and then using imaging techniques to understand how the network is responding. So one of the challenges is the electrodes themselves are in a very localized area of the brain. So it's hard to actually say what's going on across the entire brain network. So that's one area. But the other area is, say, new methods of doing the imaging in terms of measurements. A very exciting development is the optically pumped magnetometer, which is actually UCL is a pioneer in that space. And so getting a magnetometer, which used to require this big, tank of liquid helium over your head, now they can actually basically do it in a room in a less constrained environment. And it's opening up new ways to see how the brain is responding to therapies. And also, as you go about your activities of daily living, what's going on with the neural processing.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Keith, is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
I think, Tim answered it extremely well. And I would maybe just add that, the field of brain mapping has really come on leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades. And I guess that those data sets are really going to inform the imaging as well. So it's, if we have the maps of the neural circuits in the brain, we've got a much better understanding of how they function and their structure, then imaging techniques, clinical imaging techniques will naturally be informed by that. So I feel like it's an underpinning framework to allow them to infer clinical diagnosis.
Great. So I'm going to again switch slightly. Topic. This is from Jake T, who is a PhD student in brain-computer interfaces. And Jake's asking about your thoughts on non-invasive brain stimulation of healthy subjects for productivity enhancement. And I guess this is both in terms of what might be possible, but also what the ethical and societal choices might be around that. So I don't know who'd like to go first for that one.
Well, maybe I'll start with, I'm going to hold up my cup of coffee very intentionally and say this is my non-invasive, although it actually is invasive, brain and productivity enhancement mechanism. And so part of what I want to do is we temper ourselves and not look at neurotechnology out of a broader context of the things we're already doing today. Another non-invasive technology for enhancement in binoculars. Now, I'm not downplaying the need for questions, but I also want to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that we're using technology every day for enhancement. Now, specifically for neurotechnology, one of the concerns is, what if we're doing something we don't fully understand the implications? And I think that transcranial stimulation, people can actually rig up a circuit in their own home and try it on themselves. That's a topic that comes up with the regulators. And the Regulatory Horizons Council was actually just starting to open this up and say, we do need to be very thoughtful about, in the case where we might be providing some modulation that induces plasticity, or it could bring about some side effect, that we should actually consider what regulations are required to avoid people from actually harming themselves. And that's even in the area of foodstuffs and the like. Those are regulated, basically through the Food and Drug Administration or the equivalents. They are looking out for what we're consuming. That is regulated as well.
So Keith, Tim has pointed out that human enhancement technologies and interventions are a part of daily life, but of course, neurotechnology gives us a potential to do some powerful things that aren't the norm today. Any thoughts that you'd like to put on the table in terms of both the opportunities to do exciting things there, but also the ethical, regulatory, policy issues that might pose?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll maybe start an answer to that question just by emphasizing Tim's point there around plasticity. The brain is, from an engineering or a scientific perspective, it's horrifically complex. The interconnectivity there is just incredibly daunting. And that means we really don't understand what's going on at a circuit level. And so delivering pulses of energy into the brain for non-medical reasons has to be considered very, very carefully, because the brain has this ability to change, to adapt to stimuli and to form different connections. As our memories and learning happens. So we need to be pretty careful that we're not sort of messing too much with that. In terms of the immediate opportunities, Tim mentioned a cup of coffee there to help wake him up. I mean, I guess you could see wearable technologies that will help us focus. That's one area that you can imagine happening. Especially in for key decision makers, if you're looking at people in a war zone, for instance, they need to focus. It's absolutely vital that we have an understanding that they're in the correct condition to make decisions, and you can apply that clinically as well. So you can imagine a readout that helps somebody ensure that decision-making capability is there. You could also, I guess, imagine a case where we're stimulating certain regions of the brain to enhance focus and attention. So I guess these are things that perhaps on the horizon, but it's always difficult to say.
Really, really interesting. There's some great questions coming in, and I'm determined to get a couple more of my own in. So I'm going to try and wrap up 2 questions from audience members, then come to a few of my own. Please keep your questions coming. They are really interesting and helping us to make sure that we cover the topics that you want us to cover. We've got 2 questions here, which I'm sort of going to attempt to wrap up in a slightly ambitious way. One from Denis Grigoriev and one from Hannah Campbell. And Denis is asking about, beyond gaming, where else might we see neurotechnology having a presence, having an impact in terms of areas, sectors? And Hannah's asking whether neurotechnology, very topically, could help us with our current healthcare challenges in terms of, for example, the NHS and the challenges over hospital discharge and social care. So looking kind of quite broadly, where do you see opportunities for neurotechnology to really make a difference beyond the sectors and applications we've already discussed? Keith, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. I guess, if I look at my own area, we've been involved in developing retinal implants for many years, and that's a huge burden on the NHS. The age-related macular degeneration community is a major part of any ophthalmology clinic. And so new treatments there for patients where they don't have to come back time and time again to manage their condition are absolutely vital. And so if we can develop implants that can go in and interact with the neural circuits there and restore vision to patients and alleviate the burden on the NHS for repeat visits, that's absolutely critical. So I can see technologies like that coming through where that would replace current treatment regimes and have a big impact on the NHS.
Brilliant. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, there's a few. So the one, it gets back to the cognitive monitoring. This is starting with Dennis's question. So I think areas just trying to get a better understanding how people make decisions on their alertness levels. They're looking, think about, and from a certain perspective, the neurotechnology that's looking about, are you nodding your head? Are you actually paying attention to the road and doing alerts and the like? From a certain perspective is neurotechnology. And so I think that's anywhere that decision-making and vigilance is critical. And also, frankly, helping sleep. Those are another area where people are looking at technology to help us sleep better at night. I think that there's a broad spectrum there. In terms of Hannah's question, and I have, as a disclosure, I work quite a bit with Hannah. She's a close colleague. There's, in terms of the work, it gets back to the engineering. There's workflows. They're looking at bioinduction, about how you can streamline the surgical workflows to try to actually allow for greater access and, increase the throughput, if you will, the NHS and the efficiency in terms of how these technologies go in. And that's something that we have to remember. There's a lot of pragmatic questions that have to be answered and addressed, in addition to kind of the more science fiction elements that we like to talk about. In terms of other things, in terms of the community care, another area of neurotechnology is virtual reality. And it's been fascinating to see how people have applied virtual reality in a more of a community environment for treating things such as phobias. So, you can imagine the power of putting on a virtual reality helmet and you're afraid of spiders. Well, they can actually create a spider in front of you. If you're afraid of heights, they can take you up to very high levels and help you deal with this, and social phobias and the like. So I think that's the other thing, is these external systems thinking, what can they actually do to impact the way we're processing signals? And virtual reality for me is a fascinating topic to see how it's actually being pushed out into the community, helping us to scale up potential therapies and kind of deal with some of these bottlenecks in the existing way that treatments are given.
That's actually a great reminder that when we're talking about neurotechnology, it's not always about the most complex and sophisticated cutting edge technology. I think lots of us can relate to that VR example, and hopefully we'll see more applications becoming more mainstream there. But I want to put a pause on those questions and slightly take you to a different topic. And that's just to make sure that we've reflected on how well the UK is positioned to deliver on the potential of neurotechnology. We've had a lot of excitement here. Where does the UK sit in the global context? And I say this also recognizing that the UK is often has a history of being a pioneer in terms of the development of really disruptive technology. We know we can create these vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems around that leading edge research, but we don't necessarily have the strongest track record in commercializing them at scale. So I'd really be interested in your thoughts on this. And of course, you both were involved in the UK roadmap. So Tim, do you want to pick that one up to start with?
Well, so I'll get us going. I mean, one thing that we studied very carefully, actually, even before the road mapping activities, was the iHuman report, which was commissioned by the Royal Society. And they're saying, kind of, what are the strength areas that we could capitalize in the UK? And I'll kind of start with that. And one is our academic strengths and our life science community, where we have many of the best universities on the globe in terms of areas of neuroscience, some of the technologies and the like. One of the things we need to capitalize on, I think, though, is tapping into that community through the entire translation pathway. So, and to give a vignette, so the MRC unit where I work, some of the discoveries were made on brain rhythms for Parkinson's disease. They resulted in highly cited papers, but there was no intellectual property captured. And the commercialization of that approach is actually going to probably be through a US company. That's a counterpoint is a academic competitive group in Italy did file patents, did a spin out from the university, and now they're generating a company to bring it forward to commercialization. So I think in terms of the state of play, we have a great academic base. What we need to work on as a society and as a culture is actually figuring out how to continue that translation through the TRL levels, ultimately into a commercial presence that's on the NHS, and then use that to basically create taxes, if you will, wealth that then goes back and helps to fund future generations of research.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. And Keith, what would you like to say on this topic? I mean, I think you're right to point to the very strong tradition the UK's had in this area. I mean, I think you can go back right to the sort of 60s and 70s, where there's people like Giles Brindley and Nick Donaldson who've really been pioneers in this area. And I think, have we capitalized on that in the same way that the US has? Probably not, I would say, if I paraphrase Tim there. But we do have an extremely strong academic base, particularly neuroscience is tremendous in the UK. There's Nobel laureates there and the like, and they're very well engaged with the technologists now. So I think it's changing. I think the technology groups are coming together with the neuroscience groups and with the clinicians, crucially. And what Tim and I were really trying to do in that roadmap document was encourage an ecosystem where not just clinicians, neuroscientists, engineers, physicists, working together, but also the industry was involved in that, because that's a really crucial part in accelerating things through to the clinic. So that, if you like, was a sort of call to arms of the roadmap was trying to push.
Absolutely, and getting that ecosystem approach is so important for realizing the potential. Wow, we're getting so many questions in. I'm going to try and go back to the feed. We've got an interesting cluster of questions. They're not all identical, but I'm trying to shoehorn them into one around regulation. So we have Alexander C. talking about any ethical lines we should not cross with neurotechnology. It's not quite regulations, it's ethics. And then we've got Dimitris Fotis Sakalariou, who's noting that actually a lot of both software and hardware is proprietary, and so what is the significance of that, and is there a greater role for open source libraries or other resources? So I'll ask you to pick up that first, and then I've got some subsidiary ones. So Keith, can I turn to you first, please?
Yeah, sure. I think Tim's probably better placed to answer the question on the open source technologies being involved in initiatives on that front and platform technologies. So maybe I'll pass that one to Tim, and then I'll follow up if that's worth it.
Sure, go on, Tim.
Right, you think about the ethical lines we should not cross, Keith, because I'll let you pick up on that one. So I think the open source one, it's an interesting area. So, and one of the other areas highlighted in the iHuman report was the need to come up with ecosystems and platforms. And so an experiment we're doing, like I said, full disclosure with bioinduction, is they've collaborated with Oxford and other universities. Imperial College is a key partner on this with Tim Constantino's group. And we've been working on taking their proprietary platform, and it still maintains its proprietary standing, but they've enabled new research capabilities and made that then available to the academics in the United Kingdom. And there are currently 4 clinical studies in different stages. The Great Ormond Street and King's College are about to look at pediatric epilepsy, back to Louisa's question. And so it's an interesting model, I think, for open science, where they have to protect the proprietary information, but yet they're enabling new scientific capabilities and instrumentation that otherwise academics wouldn't have access to. And there's a bit of an open source movement that's going on also in the United States. It came out of the BRAIN Initiative, once again, driven by public-private partnerships with industry and academics working together. Now, the key is the proprietary is sometimes not as big of an issue as, it needs to be addressed, but regulatory issues. And so as we're developing these technologies, especially academics and entrepreneurs, really making sure that they're mindful of the work that they need to do to prove the safety of the system before it goes in and is applied. Even non-invasive systems might warrant that kind of design control and testing. And that's another area where the open source community, where we're really focusing in our work, is not on the technology per se, but actually making templates and tools available so that academics have a better understanding of the controls they need to have in place and how we ensure we can look the ethics boards and the research subjects and their clinician carers in the eye and say that this technology is going to be safe and warranted for the study.
Thank you very much, Tim, and so, some interesting parallels with other areas of engineering biology. I just want to do a quick follow-up with you before we go to Keith to tell us about the ethical red lines. Devika Kapoor is asking what you think about the Regulatory Horizons Council report on neurotech regulation. So any quick response on that from you, Tim?
Well, so Keith and I both were part of the generation, worked on the forward for it. And I think one of the elements we see, and I'm especially keen on, is developing sandboxes and areas that we can learn from the global regulatory environment, where we can say, you know, the CE mark structure, which is historically used in the UK, really focused on the product release. The early feasibility studies, investigational trials, and the like, there's some very efficient practices that I think we can look for, that early stage, first in human research, and making that more efficient. And I appreciate the Regulatory Horizons Council kind of elevating some of those ideas, because then the reason I emphasize that is that starts to build that bridge between the early TRL levels and ultimately the commercialization of the technology.
There's a really interesting topic we won't have time to go into around how do we build the capacity of the regulators to keep pace with the evolution of technologies. But I'm going to park that for a second, and I'm going to go to you, Keith, to answer this question about ethical red lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think ethics are absolutely vital for neurotechnology. You know, it's absolutely crucial that we have a sound ethical framework in place for neurotechnology development, and that we're engaging right from the outset of any research with that ethical framework. And I think that means includes, you know, not just the researchers, the clinicians, but also patient groups. They need to be aware of what's happening, because what we're talking about are devices that can modulate the brain, so it can modulate your brain state, how you feel, your emotional state potentially, but also it can read out how you're feeling, whether something's grabbed your attention, you know, what kind of emotional state you might be in. And so that data set, if you like, a very personal data set, can be, you can imagine, quite valuable to companies who are advertising, or gaming companies who are trying to learn what part of their game might interest somebody as opposed to bore them, if you like. So ownership of that data, I think, is absolutely crucial. You know, it's very, very important that the patient, the individual, owns that and can give informed consent, if you like. And that informed consent part is going to be very, very difficult as the devices become more and more advanced.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce that informed consent is becoming more and more critical as we get into these technologies. And as a follow-up, I saw some fascinating work from Cambridge kind of just a week ago about thinking about new ways to actually structure informed consents, where oftentimes, you know, it's a very fine typed words and they're getting more towards pictorials, illustrations. How do we actually, and this is for our engineering community, more effectively convey the concepts, the risks that are associated with the device? And for us as engineers to be more creative in our communication and being more transparent that way.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Now, we've got so many questions that we're not going to have time for, unfortunately, but we will try and make sure that we stay engaged on this topic. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions from the audience before we do the final opportunity for you to think of some last words to leave the audience with. Ian Nasi has a question which I think, Keith, you should take, which is, what are the prospects for diagnosis or even treatment of sight, hearing, or smell defects?
I guess hearing defects have been in place for a while now in terms of the cochlear implant, which interfaces with the auditory nerve there. That doesn't address every form of hearing defect, and I think if you want to do that, you'd have to go into the auditory cortex, and there you're probably looking at a more invasive device. People are working on these now. So it's a very hot topic. How do we interface with cortical structures that could restore things like hearing or sight? There's companies putting a lot of money into developing devices that can do that at scale. So what are the prospects? I think the auditory system, cochlear implants are there, next generation cortical implants, visual prostheses. There's been great hope of them for many decades now, never fully realized, but I think they're coming. That's a field I know very well. We're working with a company now who's just implanted in, I think 38 patients recently in the latest clinical trials. So there's big advances being made in that field, and that's all about trying to do high resolution pattern stimulation of the retina to restore aspects of a visual defect. Now, again, that's just some forms of blindness at the level of the retina. If you want to do all forms of blindness, you'd have to go into the visual cortex and the cortical structures there. That's harder. That's longer term. Still a research area. Lots of groups working on it, but it's a tough problem, right?
Thank you very much for Keith. Very helpful. I would like to give the last question before I do some wrapping up ones to you, Tim. And I'm going to try and sandwich together two cost-related questions, because we are talking about things that currently are very expensive. And so we had a question from Alexander C about, that the interface between that and the opportunity for much more equitable access to technology, which you referenced in some of your earlier remarks, Tim. And then we have a question from Jane Tunde Kelleher around how can we avoid the high failure rate seen in the development of drug technologies, which of course has a big impact on the cost of developing these interventions. So Tim, can I ask you to give some reflections on cost and equity of access, please?
Yeah, I think to start with Jane's to think about, I was actually reading that in the chat. The one thing that's interesting about using the neurotechnology is that a lot of it is also software driven. And so it's kind of fascinating to think about, and we were saying we have this research platform that we're exploring in the UK that we've worked with our industry partner on disseminating, and we're treating diseases ranging from Parkinson's, we're investigating therapies for diseases ranging from multiple system atrophy, which is a Parkinson's-like disease, to epilepsy, to chronic pain. And the way we modulate it and adjust it for different disease states is actually more of a software adjustment. And so that's kind of a unique area in neurotech is thinking about as a software basis for discovery versus some of the molecular approaches. So that gives us some degrees of freedom, even after implantation, to continue to refine and learn. But this gets back to my analogy of the wind tunnel, is that one of the things we need to do is make sure that within the device infrastructure, we can actually have this continuing learning process. Now, the point on pharma, also with the devices, one thing that's interesting with the devices today is that they can also monitor how pharma is impacting the nervous system. And so people are looking at how epilepsy anticonvulsants are actually impacting brain networks by using the sensing capabilities of these implants. But long term, part of the hope for costs is as we continue to scale up these devices, similar to other areas, the cost per unit can actually benefit. And the other thing that we're looking at in the trends is a lot of the core technologies of electronics, signal processing, batteries, we're actually benefiting immensely from commercial technology and the Internet of Things. And we can benefit by riding along that technology curve.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. And so I'm afraid we're coming to the sort of summing up section here. We could have kept going for another hour, but I promised everyone we'd keep to time. So can I just ask you for a final thought? What would you like to leave the audience with? And while you're at it, would you like to just mention whether you've got any reflections on what being a chair in emerging technology means? So I'm just going to give you a kind of quick fire opportunity for that. And I'll go to you, Keith, first, and then you, Tim. Keith.
I guess final thoughts. I think it's a tremendously exciting field. What we're doing is developing devices that can really help understand how neural circuits in the brain function, and we're trying to apply that for societal impact. And I think, as Tim just mentioned, there's been huge advances in many related areas that's really helping us accelerate that progress. So it's a tremendously exciting research area, and I think there's huge opportunities for the UK to engage in that. And I think in terms of the chair in emerging technology position, that's been absolutely pivotal in terms of my research. It's been a game changer. That platform, that 10 years of support to allow you to plan and build activity at scale, that's really unheard of in the research environment. So that's been a fantastic opportunity for us.
Thank you. Great to hear. Over to you, Tim.
So I just want to reinforce this is team science and team engineering. And so behind some of these protocols, the investigational trials, it's neurosurgeons, neurologists, engineers, regulators. It's both, and those are both from industry as well as government, as well as academics. And so many of the questions were, how do I participate? It's just look at ways to engage, because it is a massive team that's required to actually get this across the finish line. And that's where, the chair in emerging technology has benefited me by giving me the headspace to work on some of these broader ecosystems. Some of the successes and the work that has to be done don't result necessarily in a publication per se. And so what's great about the chair in emerging technologies, it gives me the freedom to explore some of these platform and community investments to set up the infrastructure that's needed.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure that the audience will join me in saying a huge thank you to you both for a really important discussion. It's been fascinating, it's been exciting, and actually at times it's also been sobering. And I've really loved also the opportunity to take an engineering lens to what is inherently, as you've just pointed out, Tim, a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, collaborative endeavour, but nonetheless one where the engineering principles can have a transformational impact. I think we all felt that sense of potential, that sense of possibility come through in what you were talking about from, the progress being made to create more sophisticated and non-invasive routes to treating and managing and even preventing neurological disease, through to some of those wider applications and perhaps some slightly unexpected places for some of us. We've also had a very clear steer that we do need to have a really conscious effort to make sure that we regulate this and we have a good engagement with society and with policymakers and with industry as we take forward these exciting technologies, and to remain clear-eyed and level-headed about the opportunity and not get carried away and tip over into hype. So I hope that this discussion has given everyone joining a greater insight into the development of neurotechnology and the fantastic work that engineers and many others are doing in this area. And if this conversation has sparked your interest in the Chairs in Emerging Technologies programme, please go have a look at our web pages. Applications for that programme are open until the 11th of April, so you've got some time. And if you've got any further comments about today's event, there's a survey that I think there's a link being posted in the chat right now. It's going to be emailed to you following the event. So please do participate in that, because your feedback helps us to shape and improve future events. And stay tuned for future critical conversations on our LinkedIn page. But for now, thank you again to our fantastic speakers. Thank you all for joining us and for your very insightful questions. Hope you have a great evening. Bye, everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.